They say money can't buy happiness, but it can certainly buy freedom. And today, I learned what it feels like to have both stripped away by the very people who claim to love you most. My name is Donna Stewart, and I'm 74 years old. For the past 3 months, I've been living like a prisoner in my own home, asking permission to buy groceries, begging for $20 like a child asking for allowance. My own children have decided I'm no longer capable of managing my affairs, and today they made it official. But what they don't know could change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday. I was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made countless breakfasts for 3 ungrateful children, stirring my coffee and watching the news. The anchor was discussing the housing market, interest rates climbing again, and I found myself mentally calculating the impact on rental yields. It's a habit I've had for years. Though my children would be shocked to know they're supposedly declining, Mother still keeps such sharp tabs on financial trends. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:30. I knew it would be them before I even looked through the peephole. David, my eldest at 52, stood on my front porch in his expensive suit, briefcase in hand like he was arriving for a board meeting. Behind him, Patricia, my only daughter at 48, clutched a manila folder against her chest like armor. And Michael, my baby at 45, shifted nervously from foot to foot, unable to meet anyone's eyes even through the glass. I could have pretended not to be home. I could have let them stand there knocking until they gave up and left. But that would only delay the inevitable. And at my age, I've learned that putting off unpleasant conversations only makes them worse. "Good morning, Mother." David's voice carried that patronizing tone he'd perfected in his corporate climb, the same voice he probably used with underperforming employees. He kissed my cheek with the mechanical precision of someone fulfilling an obligation. Patricia pushed past him without ceremony, her heels clicking against my hardwood floors like a countdown timer. "Mom, we need to talk. All of us. Together." Michael finally looked at me, and I saw guilt written across his features like a confession. "Hi, Mom. You look good." He always was the worst liar of the 3. They arranged themselves in my living room like a tribunal. David took the wingback, chair that had been his father's favorite, a choice that felt both symbolic and cruel. Patricia perched on the edge of the sofa, her folder now open, papers spread across my coffee table like evidence at a trial. Michael slumped into the corner chair, looking like he wished he could disappear entirely. "Mom, we're worried about you." Patricia's voice carried the artificial warmth of a social worker delivering bad news. "We've been talking, and we think it's time we discuss some changes." I remained standing, gripping the back of my own chair. Something about sitting felt like surrendering ground I wasn't ready to give up. "What kind of changes?" David leaned forward, hands clasped like he was about to deliver a presentation. "We've noticed some concerning patterns lately, Mother. The bills that were paid late last month. The credit card statements showing purchases that don't make sense. That check you wrote to someone none of us had ever heard of." "I pay my bills when I choose to pay them," I said, though I knew exactly which late payments he meant. The mortgage on the Riverside property had been delayed because I was waiting for rent collection from 3 different tenants. The utility bill for my Maple Street duplex had slipped my mind during negotiations with a contractor. But they didn't know about those properties, so to them it looked like confusion. "Mom, you spent $800 at a hardware store last month," Patricia chimed in, consulting her papers like a prosecutor. "When David asked you about it, you couldn't remember what you bought." Of course I remembered. I'd purchased supplies for renovating the bathroom in Unit 4B, plus materials for the kitchen backsplash in the Riverside property. But how could I explain that without revealing everything? The lie had been easier. Let them think their old mother was getting forgetful rather than expose the business empire they never knew existed. "And there's the matter of you giving $5,000 to someone named Maria Gonzalez," David continued. When we asked about it, you said she was a friend who needed help. But none of us have ever met this Maria. Maria had been one of my first tenants 15 years ago. A single mother working 2 jobs, trying to save for a down payment on her own place. When she finally found a house she could afford, she was $2,000 short on closing costs. I'd given her $5,000, not just for the closing but to help with moving expenses and getting settled. 6 months later, she'd paid me back every penny with interest she insisted on adding. But that transaction had gone through my personal account, not my business accounts. And now it looked suspicious to my children's untrained eyes. I help people, I said simply. I always have. We know you do, Mom. Michael spoke for the first time since entering my house. But lately, it seems like your judgment might be… He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Compromised. David finished for him. We think you might be getting taken advantage of. People see an elderly woman living alone and they target you. It happens all the time. The word elderly hit me like a slap. Is that how they saw me? Not as their mother who had raised them, supported them, sacrificed for them. Not as a woman who had survived the Great Recession, the death of their father, and countless other challenges. Just as an elderly target, vulnerable and declining. Patricia reached into her folder and pulled out a document I recognized immediately. My stomach dropped. We've been to see a lawyer, Mom, about getting legal guardianship over your finances. The room went silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock their father had bought me for our 25th anniversary. Each tick felt like another second of my independence counting down. We don't want to do this, Michael said quickly, but we can't watch you make decisions that might hurt you, or let people take advantage of your generous nature. This is for your protection, David added. We'll make sure all your bills are paid on time, that your money is safe, that you have everything you need. Everything I need, I repeated slowly. And who decides what I need? We do, Patricia said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Between the 3 of us, we can make sure you're taken care of properly. I looked at my children, these people I had brought into the world, nursed through illnesses, helped through college, supported through divorces and career changes and financial crises of their own. David, who had borrowed $15,000 from me just 3 years ago when his consulting business hit a rough patch. Patricia, whose divorce lawyer fees I had quietly covered without her ex-husband knowing. Michael, whose mortgage I had co-signed when his credit wasn't quite good enough, on its own. And now they sat in my living room telling me I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs. What if I refuse? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I asked. The 3 of them exchanged glances. It was Patricia who answered. We hoped it wouldn't come to that. But if necessary, we can petition the court. The evidence of financial confusion is pretty clear. Evidence. They were building. A case against me using my own kindness, my own strategic business decisions that they couldn't understand because they didn't know the full picture. We've already spoken to your bank, David said, pulling out another document. They've agreed to freeze your accounts temporarily while we sort this out. And we've contacted the credit card companies. My blood ran cold. You did what? It's just temporary, Michael said quickly. Just until we can get the legal paperwork finalized and set up new accounts with proper oversight. Oversight. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. From my own children. We're doing this because we love you, Patricia said, and I almost believed she meant it. We can't stand by and watch you make mistakes that could cost you everything. If only they knew how much everything actually was. I walked to the window and looked out at my garden. The roses needed pruning, and the hedge was getting overgrown. Such simple problems with simple solutions. Not like the complex web of deception I'd been weaving for 15 years. protecting not just my own interests but theirs as well. When does this take effect? I asked without turning around. Immediately, David said. We'll give you a weekly allowance for groceries and personal expenses. Anything larger than $50, you'll need to discuss with Patricia first. She's agreed to be the primary financial guardian. Patricia, who had never balanced her own checkbook properly until she was 35. Patricia, who had needed my help to understand the basics of her divorce settlement. Patricia, who thought a good investment was a savings account earning 0.5% interest. What about my car? I asked. You can keep driving, Michael said, but we'll be handling the insurance and maintenance. And my house? We'll make sure all the utilities and property taxes are paid on time, Patricia assured me. You don't need to worry about any of that anymore. They had it all figured out. My entire life reduced to a weekly allowance and pre-approved expenses. I would become a child again in my 70s, dependent on their permission for everything beyond the most basic needs. I turned back to face them. I suppose I don't have much choice. You really don't, Mom, David said, and for a moment his businessman mask slipped, and I saw something that might have been genuine concern. We're scared we're going to lose you. Not just your money, but you. If someone takes advantage of you, or if you make a mistake that costs you the house. We couldn't live with ourselves, Patricia finished. They meant well. I had to believe that, or the betrayal would be too much to bear. They genuinely thought they were protecting a confused old woman from her own poor judgment. They had no idea they were caging a lioness. After they left, taking my credit cards, my checkbook, and my financial independence with them, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The same kitchen where I'd planned family dinners and birthday parties, where I'd helped with homework and kissed scraped knees. Now it felt like a prison cell. But as the afternoon shadows grew longer, I found myself walking to my study. The room had been my husband's office when he was alive, and I'd maintained it as a kind of shrine for the first few years after his death. But gradually, it had become something else entirely. My real office, my command center. I moved the family photo on the bookshelf, the one of all of us at David's wedding 15 years ago. Behind it was a small key taped to the wall, invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. The key opened a locked drawer in the desk, and inside that drawer was everything my children thought they were protecting me from losing. Bank statements from accounts they didn't know existed. Property. Deeds in my name alone. Business licenses and tax returns for Stewart Property Management LLC. Investment portfolios and rental agreements and contractor invoices. 15 years of careful, strategic, profitable business decisions that had turned a modest inheritance from my mother into something my children couldn't even imagine. They thought they were rescuing a confused old woman with $30,000 in checking, and maybe twice that in retirement savings. They had no idea their mother controlled assets, worth over $2 million. I opened my laptop, the one they'd probably assume was just for email and online shopping, and logged into my business accounts. Everything was still there, untouched by their financial intervention. The rental income that deposited automatically, every month. The investment dividends that had been growing steadily for years. The business checking account that could have paid off all 3 of their mortgages without making a dent. Tomorrow, I had a meeting with a development company that wanted to buy my entire residential portfolio. They were offering $4.2 million for properties I'd purchased for less than half that over the years. It would be the biggest financial decision of my life, and I'd have to make it while pretending to my own children that I couldn't be trusted with grocery money. I pulled out my secure phone, the one I used only for business calls, and dialed a number I knew by heart. Maria, it's Donna. Yes, I know it's been a while. Listen, I need a favor, and it's going to sound strange. I explained about my children's intervention, about the frozen accounts and the financial guardianship. I need someone to be my hands and voice for the next few weeks while I figure out how to handle this. Maria had become more than a former tenant over the years. She'd started her own small business with my encouragement and investment, and now she managed 3 of my properties as well as her own growing portfolio. She understood business, she understood loyalty, and most importantly, she understood keeping secrets. "Of course, Doña Donna," she said, using the respectful title she'd called me since we first met. "What do you need?" "Tomorrow's meeting with Harrison Development. I can't be there officially, but I need you there as my representative. The power of attorney paperwork is in the safe, and I'll have it ready for you to pick up tonight. And your children. What will you tell them?" I looked at the photo on my desk, the one of my 3 children at various ages, all smiling and innocent and completely unaware of the sacrifices their mother had made to secure their futures. "Nothing," I said. "Not yet. But soon, they're going to learn that their old, confused mother has been playing a game they never even knew existed." After I hung up, I sat in my study as darkness fell outside. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times, each note echoing through my empty house. Tomorrow, I would wake up as a ward of my own children, asking permission to buy coffee and explaining every purchase over $50. But tonight, I was still Donna Stewart, businesswoman and property mogul, about to make the biggest deal of her career while her own family tried to save her from imaginary threats. They wanted to protect me from making financial mistakes. What they didn't understand was that the biggest mistake would be letting them succeed. The game was about to change, and they had no idea what their mother was truly capable of. But they were going to find out. I locked the drawer, replaced the photo, and turned off the lights in my study. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new ways to navigate the restrictions they'd placed on me while still running a business empire they couldn't imagine. But tonight, I allowed myself a small smile. They thought they'd won, thought they'd successfully caged their declining mother, for her own good. They had no idea the cage door was never actually locked. The morning after my children stripped away my financial freedom, I woke up feeling like a stranger in my own life. The sunrise looked the same through my bedroom window. The coffee maker still gurgled in the kitchen, but everything had changed overnight. I was no longer Donna Stewart, independent woman. I was now their version of me, confused, vulnerable, in need of protection. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing clothes that would help me blend into the background. A simple navy cardigan, comfortable walking shoes, and the kind of handbag that screams, "harmless grandmother." The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially putting on a costume to move freely through my own life. Patricia had left a debit card on my kitchen counter the night before, attached to what she called my household account. $500 for groceries, pharmacy, visits, and small personal expenses. She'd explained it like she was doing me a tremendous favor, setting up this system so I wouldn't have to bother with managing money anymore. $500. I'd made more than that in rental income yesterday alone. But I smiled and thanked. Her played the grateful mother accepting her daughter's generous care. What choice did I have? The alternative was a court battle that would expose everything, and I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. My first stop was the bank, where I needed to test exactly how restricted my access had become. The young teller, probably not much, older than my grandchildren, looked at me with the kind of patient sympathy reserved for elderly customers who might not understand modern banking. "I'd like to check my account balance," I said, handing her my old bank card. She typed for a moment, then frowned at her screen. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Stewart, but this account has been restricted. I can see that there are authorized parties who can access it for you. Would you like me to call one of them?" "No, that's quite all right." I kept my voice light, disappointed but not surprised. "They're handling things for me now." "That's wonderful that you have family looking out for you," she said with genuine warmth. "So many elderly customers come in here alone, struggling with all the complicated financial stuff. It's nice when children step up to help. I wanted to tell her that some of us elderly customers had been handling complicated financial matters since before she was born. Instead, I nodded and thanked her for her time. My next stop required a 20-minute bus ride to a part of town my children had never visited. The neighborhoods here weren't dangerous, just working class, filled with small businesses and modest homes. The kind of area where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about a well-dressed older woman stepping off the city bus. The building I entered looked unremarkable from the outside. Faded brick, small windows, a simple sign that read, Riverside Professional Services. Most people walking by wouldn't give it a second glance. That had always been the point. I climbed to the third floor, my knees protesting more than they used to, but still carrying me without complaint. The hallway was quiet, lined with doors belonging to accountants, insurance agents, and small law firms. At the end of the corridor was Suite 312, with a modest placard reading, S Property Management. I used my key to let myself in. The office was small but efficiently organized. 2 desks, filing cabinets, a conference table that could seat 6 people, and a window that looked out over the busy street below. This had been my real workplace for 15 years, the headquarters of an empire my children never knew existed. Maria looked up from her computer as I entered, her face breaking into a warm smile. Doña Donna, right on time. I have the Harrison development contracts ready for review. Maria Gonzalez had become so much more than the struggling single mother I'd helped years ago. She was sharp, ambitious, and had learned the property business with the dedication of someone who understood what it meant to build something from nothing. When I'd offered her a position managing some of my smaller properties, she'd thrown herself into the work with an intensity that reminded me of myself at her age. How did the initial meeting go yesterday? I asked, settling into my desk chair, for what I knew might be the last time in a while. They're serious buyers, Maria said, pulling out a thick folder. Harrison Development has the financing in place, and they're willing to close within 60 days. The offer is exactly what we discussed, $4.2 million for the entire residential portfolio. $4.2 million. Enough money to secure my children's futures, pay for my grandchildren's educations, and still leave me with more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. And my own children thought I needed protection from spending $800 at a hardware store. I reviewed the contracts carefully, my mind automatically calculating terms, timelines, and tax implications. This was the business acumen my children had never seen. The sharp financial thinking they assumed had deteriorated with age. There's one complication, Maria said gently. They want to meet with you directly before finalizing everything. Harrison Development is old school. They like to shake hands with the actual property owner, especially on a deal this size. My heart sank. How could I explain that the property owner was currently under financial guardianship, forbidden from making any decisions involving more than $50 without permission? When do they want to meet? Tomorrow afternoon. I tried to convince them that I could handle everything as your representative, but they insisted. They said it's company policy for deals over $1 million. I stared out the window, watching people hurry along the sidewalk below. Normal people living normal lives, making their own decisions about their own money. I'll figure something out. Doña Donna, Maria said carefully, maybe it's time to tell your children the truth about all of this. She gestured around the office, then at the contracts representing millions of dollars in assets. It's complicated, I said, though that was an understatement of epic proportions. Is it? You built something amazing here. You helped dozens of families find homes, created jobs, made smart investments that benefited everyone involved. Why would you be ashamed of that? Why indeed? The question had been haunting me since my children's intervention yesterday. Why had I kept this secret for so long? Why had I let them believe their mother was just a widow living off Social Security, and their father's modest life insurance policy? The truth was complicated, rooted in promises made to a dying husband, and fears about family dynamics that had seemed important at the time, but now felt almost trivial. When I started this business, I said slowly, your father had just died. The children were dealing with their own grief, their own financial pressures. David was trying to establish his consulting firm. Patricia was going through her divorce. Michael was struggling with the mortgage on his first house. Maria listened patiently as I explained the web of circumstances that had led to 15 years of secrecy. I inherited $50,000 from my mother's estate. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to start small. I bought my first rental property, a duplex that needed work but had good bones. The children knew about the inheritance, but they assumed I'd just put it in savings somewhere. Instead, you built an empire, Maria said with admiration. I built security, I corrected. Not just for me, but for all of them. Every property I bought, every investment I made, it was all part of a larger plan to make sure my family would be taken care of if anything happened to me. The irony was overwhelming. I'd spent 15 years secretly building wealth to protect my children's futures, and now they were trying to protect me from my own financial decisions. The problem is, I continued, the longer I kept the secret, the harder it became to reveal it. How do you tell your adult children that you've been lying to them for over a decade? How do you explain that every time they worried about me living on a fixed income, I was actually making more money than all three of them combined? Maria was quiet for a moment, then asked the question I'd been dreading. What about their father? Did he know? I turned away from her, unable to meet her eyes. This was the part of the story I'd never told anyone, the secret that made all the other secrets necessary. Their father had problems, I said quietly. Financial problems that he hid from everyone, including me, until it was almost too late. The memories came flooding back, as fresh and painful as if it had happened yesterday instead of 16 years ago. Robert, my husband of 38 years, had developed a gambling addiction in the last 5 years of his life. Not the obvious kind, with trips to casinos or scratch-off tickets. He'd gotten involved in high-stakes poker games, convinced he could win enough to secure our retirement. Instead, he'd lost nearly everything we'd saved together. I only found out when he was diagnosed with cancer, I continued. He was dying, and he finally confessed that he'd gambled away most of our savings. He'd taken out a second mortgage on the house, borrowed against his life insurance policy, even taken cash advances on credit cards. Maria's eyes widened. How much? Almost $200,000 in debt, most of it hidden from me, through accounts I didn't know existed. The shame in my voice was unmistakable, even after all these years. He died 6 months later, and I was left to clean up the mess without destroying his memory for the children. So you paid off his debts quietly and never told them. I couldn't bear to tarnish their father's memory. They'd already lost him to cancer. I couldn't take away their respect for him, too. I wiped away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. I used my mother's inheritance to pay off the worst of it, then started the property business to generate enough income to handle the rest. That's why you've been so secretive about money, Maria said with understanding. You were protecting them from the truth about their father. And protecting myself from their questions about how I was managing to live so well on so little visible income. I laughed bitterly. I never imagined they'd eventually decide I was too incompetent to handle my own finances. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of 16 years of secrets hanging between us. Outside, the afternoon was getting later, and I knew I needed to get home before my children started checking on me. The Harrison Development meeting, Maria said finally. We need to make this work. This is too good an opportunity to let slip away because of family drama. She was right. The property market was strong now, but markets change. Harrison Development was offering top dollar for properties that might be worth significantly less in a few years if the economy took a downturn. I have an idea, I said slowly. but it's going to require some creativity. I explained my plan to Maria, who listened with growing amazement and no small amount of concern. "Are you sure about this?" she asked when I finished. "If your children find out." "If they find out, maybe it's time they learned the whole truth anyway." I stood up and gathered my things. "Set up the meeting with Harrison Development for tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Tell them the property owner will be there. And if they ask questions about your situation?" I smiled, feeling more like my old self than I had since yesterday's intervention. "Let me worry about that." The bus ride home gave me time to think through all the details of what I was about to attempt. It was risky, potentially disastrous if it went wrong. But it was also the kind of calculated risk that had built my business empire in the first place. Back home, I made dinner from ingredients I'd purchased with my allowance debit card, trying to get used to the reality of asking permission for every financial decision. Patricia called during dinner to check on me, her voice carrying the overly cheerful tone people use with children and the elderly. "How was your day, Mom? Did you need anything?" "Just fine, dear. I went to the bank and did a little shopping." Both technically true, though she'd never guessed the real nature of either activity. "That's good. And you're feeling okay about everything? The new arrangement?" "I'm adjusting," I said, which was also true in ways she couldn't imagine. "Good. David wants to take you to lunch tomorrow, if you're up for it. He feels bad about yesterday." My heart rate quickened. Lunch tomorrow would conflict with the Harrison Development meeting, the most important business meeting of my career. That's sweet of him, but I already have plans tomorrow afternoon. "Oh? What kind of plans?" I thought quickly. "I'm having lunch with an old friend, someone from church." The lie came easier than I'd expected, which probably said something about how this whole situation was changing me. "That's wonderful, Mom. I'm so glad you're staying social." "Which friend?" "Maria Gonzalez. You don't know her." Again, technically true. "Well, have a nice time. And remember, if you need anything at all, just call." After we hung up, I sat in my living room, surrounded by photos of my children at various stages of their lives. Birthday parties, graduations, weddings, grandchildren's first steps. A whole lifetime of memories, built on love and sacrifice, and the kind of quiet strength that goes unnoticed until it's gone. Tomorrow, I would risk everything on a single meeting. If it went well, I could secure the financial future I'd been building for 15 years. If it went badly, I might lose not just the business deal, but any remaining illusion that I was still capable of managing my own life. But as I prepared for bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: excitement. For the first time since my children's intervention, I was about to do something that mattered, something that would use the skills and experience they thought I'd lost. I opened my laptop one more time and checked the balances in my business. Accounts. Tomorrow's meeting could change everything, but tonight, I was still the woman who had built something remarkable from nothing, who had turned $50,000 into an empire worth millions. My children thought they were protecting a confused old woman from her own poor judgment. Tomorrow, they might learn that their mother's judgment was sharper than they'd ever imagined, and that the woman they thought needed protection was about to make the biggest deal of her career. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The morning of the Harrison Development meeting, I woke with the kind of nervous energy I hadn't felt in years. It reminded me of my wedding day, or the morning I'd given birth to David, that mix of anticipation and terror that comes when you know your life is about to change irrevocably. I chose my outfit with the care of a general preparing for battle. A charcoal gray business suit I'd bought years ago but rarely had occasion to wear, paired with my grandmother's pearl necklace. I needed to look like someone capable of making multi-million-dollar decisions, not like someone whose children had recently taken away her credit cards for her own protection. The makeup took longer than usual. My hands weren't quite steady as I applied lipstick, and I had to start over twice with the eyeliner. Ridiculous, really. I'd been in countless business meetings over the years, negotiated dozens of property deals, but none of them had carried the weight of this afternoon's encounter. At 11:30, I called a taxi. I couldn't risk taking the bus today, not when timing was so crucial. The driver was a pleasant man in his 60s who reminded me of my late husband, and we chatted about the weather during the 20-minute drive to downtown. "Big meeting today?" he asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror as we pulled up to the sleek glass building that housed Harrison Development's offices. "The biggest," I admitted. "Well, you look like someone who knows what she's doing. Good luck." If only it were that simple. The Harrison Development offices occupied 3 floors of one of the city's most prestigious business towers. Everything about the place screamed success and serious money, from the marble lobby to the art-filled reception area on the 15th floor. I announced myself to the receptionist, a polished young woman who clearly hadn't expected someone of my age and appearance. "Mrs. Stewart, for the 2 o'clock with Mr. Harrison?" "That's correct." She made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones, then smiled at me with professional courtesy. "Mr. Harrison will be with you shortly. Can I offer you coffee or water?" "Coffee would be lovely, thank you." As I waited, I reviewed everything I knew about Harrison Development. They were a family-owned company, 3rd generation, with a reputation for fair dealing and solid financial backing. They specialized in converting older residential properties into modern mixed-use developments, exactly the kind of buyer who would see the potential in my carefully curated portfolio. "Mrs. Stewart?" I looked up to see a man in his 50s approaching, hand extended in greeting. James Harrison III was younger than I'd expected, with silver at his temples and the kind of confident bearing that comes from inherited success. "Mr. Harrison, thank you for meeting with me." "The pleasure is entirely mine. I've been looking forward to discussing your properties. Shall we head to the conference room?" He led me down a hallway lined with architectural renderings of completed projects, each one representing millions in successful developments. The conference room itself was intimidating in its opulence, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a table large enough to seat 20 people. 2 other individuals were already seated. A woman introduced as the company's chief financial officer, and a man who served as their head of acquisitions. Both were significantly younger than me, probably closer to my children's ages, and I caught the subtle glance they exchanged when I entered the room. "Mrs. Stewart," James Harrison began once we were all seated, "I have to say, your property portfolio is quite impressive. 23 residential units across 8 different buildings, all in excellent condition and strategically located in neighborhoods showing strong appreciation trends." "Thank you. I've worked hard to build something sustainable." "That's evident. What I'm curious about is your long-term strategy. These properties represent significant value, but they also require active management. Are you looking to liquidate because the workload has become too much?" The question hung in the air, and I realized this was my first real test. How much should I reveal about my current situation? Too little, and they might question my motivations. Too much, and they might doubt my legal authority to make this deal. "I'm 74 years old, Mr. Harrison. I've been managing these properties successfully for 15 years, but I'm at a stage in my life where I need to consider simplifying my affairs." "Understandable. And you have family, children who might be involved in this decision?" My throat tightened. "I have 3 adult children, yes, but this is my decision to make." The CFO leaned forward slightly. "We always like to ensure that all parties with a potential interest in a transaction are aware of our discussions. Is there anyone else we should be including in these negotiations?" "No," I said firmly. "I am the sole owner of these properties, and I have the legal authority to sell them." That was true, technically. My children's financial guardianship didn't extend to assets they didn't know existed. But the ethical implications of what I was doing were becoming more complex by the minute. Excellent, James said. Then let's talk specifics. For the next hour, we went through every detail of the proposed sale: purchase price, closing timeline, inspection periods, and contingencies. I found myself back in my element, the sharp-minded businesswoman who had built this empire from nothing. These people weren't seeing a confused elderly woman who needed protection from her own decisions. They were seeing a savvy property owner who knew exactly what her assets were worth. The timeline is aggressive, the acquisitions director noted. 60 days from contract to closing. Are you confident you can meet all the requirements in that time frame? I wouldn't have agreed to the timeline if I couldn't meet it, I replied. All the properties are current on taxes and inspections. The titles are clear, and I have all the necessary documentation organized and ready for review. And financing contingencies? The CFO asked. We'd prefer a cash deal if possible. Cash would be fine, I said, as if discussing the sale. Of a $4 million property portfolio for cash was the most natural thing in the world. James Harrison smiled. Mrs. Stewart, I have to say, in 30 years of doing these deals, it's refreshing to work with someone who clearly knows their business as well as you do. I've had good teachers, I said, thinking of all the mistakes and successes that had brought me to this moment. There is one final matter, James continued, and something in his tone made me tense. Our legal department requires that we verify the seller's capacity to enter into contracts of this magnitude. It's purely procedural, you understand, but given the size of the transaction, my heart began to race. What kind of verification? Nothing invasive. Usually just a letter from your attorney confirming that you're legally competent to make this decision, or documentation showing that you have appropriate financial power of attorney if there are any concerns about capacity. The room suddenly felt too warm. This was the complication I'd been dreading, the moment when my children's intervention could destroy everything I'd worked to build. Is there a problem, Mrs. Stewart? The CFO asked gently. You look a bit pale. I took a sip of water, buying time to think. The truth was, I probably couldn't get a letter from my attorney confirming my legal capacity to make financial decisions, because yesterday my own children had successfully argued that I lacked exactly that capacity. My family situation is complicated at the moment, I said carefully. My children have some concerns about my financial management, and they've recently taken steps to provide me with additional oversight. The three Harrison development executives exchanged glances, and I could see the deal slipping away before my eyes. What kind of oversight? James asked. They've established themselves as financial guardians. Temporarily, I added quickly. They're concerned about protecting me from potential financial exploitation. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. I watched as James consulted quietly with his colleagues, their expressions growing more concerned by the moment. Mrs. Stewart, James said finally, I appreciate your honesty. But if your family has established financial guardianship, we need to understand exactly what authority you have to enter into this transaction. I am still the legal owner of these properties, I insisted. The guardianship relates to my personal accounts, not my business assets. But the proceeds from this sale would presumably flow to accounts that are now under guardianship oversight, the CFO pointed out. That could create legal complications for everyone involved. I felt the walls closing in around me, months of planning, years of building toward this moment, and it was all going to collapse because my own children thought they were protecting me. There might be a solution, I said, an idea forming even as I spoke. What if we structured the transaction through my business entity rather than as a personal sale? Stewart Property Management LLC owns several of the properties, and that entity isn't subject to the personal guardianship arrangements. James looked intrigued. How many of the properties are held by the LLC? I did quick mental calculations. 16 of the 23 units. The others are in my personal name, but I could potentially transfer them to the LLC before closing. That could work, the acquisitions director said thoughtfully, as long as you have full authority to act on behalf of the LLC. I'm the sole owner and president, I confirmed. I have complete authority over all business decisions. James Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying me with new interest. Mrs. Stewart, I'm beginning to think there's more to your story than we initially understood. He wasn't wrong. There was so much more to my story than anyone understood, including my own children. Mr. Harrison, I said, deciding that partial honesty was my best strategy. I've been managing property investments for 15 years. I've built a substantial portfolio through careful planning and conservative growth. My children see an elderly mother who occasionally pays bills late or makes purchases they don't understand. They don't see the business side of my life because I've kept it separate from family matters. Why the separation? The CFO asked. Because mixing family and business rarely ends well, I replied. My children have their own financial pressures, their own career challenges. I didn't want them to see me as a resource to be tapped or a decision maker to be influenced. I wanted to maintain my independence while still being their mother. James nodded slowly. And now that independence is being challenged. By people who love me and think they're protecting me, I said. But yes, it's being challenged. What happens if we move forward with this deal? James asked. Will your children try to interfere or challenge the sale? It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding thinking about too deeply. I hope that by the time the sale is complete, I'll have found a way to explain the situation to them that helps them understand what I've built and why. And if you can't? I met his gaze directly. Then I'll deal with the consequences. I heard through the grapevine that you might be selling some properties. I wanted to talk to you about possibly buying my unit before you make any final decisions. Could we meet sometime this week? I have a proposition that might interest you. Ray Morrison was a good tenant, always paid on time, kept his place immaculate, and had been living in Unit 2A for almost 8 years. He was also a detective with the city police department, which made his sudden interest in buying rather than renting intriguing. I replied to his email agreeing to meet, then sat back in my chair wondering if this was the universe offering me an alternative path. If I couldn't sell the entire portfolio to Harrison Development, maybe I could begin selling properties individually to people who already knew their value. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was having coffee and reading the newspaper when the doorbell rang at 9:30 sharp. Through the peephole, I saw Patricia standing on my porch, but she wasn't alone. A woman I didn't recognize stood beside her, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of conservative business attire that screamed professional authority. I opened the door with a sinking feeling in my stomach. "Good morning, Mom," Patricia said, her smile too bright and her tone too cheerful. "I hope you don't mind us stopping by unannounced. This is Dr. Sarah Chen from Geriatric Assessment Services." Dr. Chen stepped forward with practiced warmth. "Mrs. Stewart, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your daughter has arranged for me to conduct a routine cognitive assessment, just to make sure you're getting all the support you need." A cognitive assessment. My own daughter had arranged for a stranger to come into my home and evaluate whether I was mentally competent to manage my own life. "I wasn't aware I needed an assessment," I said carefully, stepping back to let them in because refusing would only confirm their suspicions. "It's just precautionary," Patricia said quickly. After the financial guardianship was established, Dr. Chen recommended a formal evaluation to help us understand how best to support you going forward. Dr. Chen had already taken note of my immaculate living room, the organized bookshelf, the lack of any obvious signs of confusion or neglect. I could see her mentally checking boxes on whatever evaluation criteria she used. "Mrs. Stewart, these assessments are quite routine," she said, settling into the chair Patricia indicated. We'll just have a conversation about your daily routines, do some simple memory exercises, maybe review your medication management. Nothing to be concerned about. Nothing to be concerned about, except that the results of this evaluation could determine whether I retained any autonomy over my own life. May I ask who referred you to my daughter? I asked, taking a seat across from them. We work with several elder law attorneys in the area, Dr. Chen replied diplomatically. When families are establishing care arrangements, they often want professional guidance about their loved one's cognitive status. Elder law attorneys. My children had been more thorough than I'd realized, building a case for their intervention with professional documentation and expert opinions. Mom? Patricia said, reaching over to pat my hand. I know this feels intrusive, but we just want to make sure you're safe and getting appropriate care. If the assessment shows you're doing well, then we can all feel more confident about the current arrangements. And if it shows I'm not doing well, they'll have professional justification for taking even more control over my life. Shall we begin? Dr. Chen asked, opening her portfolio to reveal a tablet and several printed forms. For the next hour, I submitted to the most humiliating experience of my adult life. Dr. Chen asked me to remember lists of words, solve simple math problems, explain what I would do in various emergency scenarios. She inquired about my daily routines, my social connections, my understanding of current events. Tell me about your financial management, she said, and I felt Patricia tense beside me. How do you typically handle bills, banking, that sort of thing? My daughter handles most of that now, I replied, the words tasting like defeat. She's helping me stay organized. And how do you feel about that arrangement? I glanced at Patricia, who was watching me with the intensity of someone whose entire intervention strategy might be validated or undermined by my answer. It's an adjustment, I said carefully. But I understand their concerns. Dr. Chen made notes on her tablet, then moved on to questions about my medical history, my medications, my exercise habits. She seemed particularly interested in any episodes of confusion or forgetfulness I might have experienced recently. Your daughter mentioned some concerning incidents with late bill payments and unusual purchases, she said. Can you tell me about those from your perspective? This was the moment when I could have told the truth. I could have explained that. The late payments were strategic business decisions, that the unusual purchases were property investments, that every financial choice they found concerning was actually evidence of sophisticated business planning. Instead, I shrugged. I suppose I've been a bit scattered lately. It's hard to keep track of everything sometimes. Patricia smiled with what looked like relief, and I realized I'd just provided confirmation for every concern she'd raised with Dr. Chen. That's very common, Dr. Chen said gently. Many people find financial management becomes more challenging as they age. Having family support can be tremendously helpful. When the assessment finally ended, Dr. Chen packed up her materials with professional efficiency. Mrs. Stewart, I'll be sending a report to your daughter within a few days. Overall, you seem to be managing quite well, though I do see some areas where additional support could be beneficial. After they left, I sat in my living room feeling like I'd just collaborated in my own diminishment. I'd passed their test well enough to avoid more drastic interventions, but I'd also reinforced their belief that I needed the protection they were providing. My phone rang, and I saw Maria's name on the caller ID. Doña Donna, I have news about Detective Morrison. He wants to meet this afternoon if possible. He says he has a proposal that could solve some of our problems. What kind of proposal? He wouldn't give details over the phone, but he mentioned something about helping you maintain control over your properties, even if your family situation becomes more complicated. 2 hours later, I found myself in a coffee shop downtown, meeting with Ray Morrison and wondering if I was about to make my situation infinitely more complex. Ray was a solid man in his early 50s, with the kind of steady presence that probably served him well in police work. Mrs. Stewart, I appreciate you meeting with me on short notice, he said, sliding into the booth across from me. I know this might seem unusual, but I've been thinking about your situation ever since Maria mentioned you might be selling properties. What exactly did Maria tell you? Just that you're dealing with some family complications that are affecting your business decisions. She didn't go into details, but I've been a cop for 27 years. I recognize family intervention when I see it. I studied his face, trying to read his intentions. And what do you think you see? But I won't let their good intentions destroy something I've spent 15 years creating. The room fell quiet again as the Harrison development team processed everything I'd told them. I could see them weighing the potential complications against the attractiveness of the deal itself. Mrs. Stewart, James said finally, your properties are exactly what we're looking for, and your asking price is fair for both parties. But we can't move forward with a transaction that might be legally challenged later. My heart sank. This was it. The moment when my children's intervention would cost me the biggest opportunity of my business career. What would you need to feel comfortable moving forward? I asked. Honestly? We'd need to meet with your children, or at least their attorney, to understand the scope of the guardianship and confirm that this sale wouldn't violate its terms. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. The whole point of keeping my business, life separate, had been to avoid exactly this kind of family involvement in my financial decisions. That's not possible, I said quietly. Then I'm afraid we can't proceed, James replied with genuine regret. I'm sorry, Mrs. Stewart. In different circumstances, this would have been an ideal transaction for everyone involved. I sat in that conference room, surrounded by architectural renderings of successful developments, and felt 15 years of careful planning crumble around me. The irony was overwhelming. My children's efforts to protect me from bad financial decisions were preventing me from making the best financial decision of my life. I understand, I said, gathering my composure and preparing to leave. Thank you for your time. Mrs. Stewart, James said as I stood to go, if circumstances change, if you find a way to resolve the family situation, please don't hesitate to contact us. This offer will remain open for 60 days. I shook hands with each of them, maintaining my dignity even as my world fell apart. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like descending into a grave, each floor marking another level of my defeat. Outside the building, I called Maria to tell her what had happened. She listened in stunned silence as I explained how close we'd come to completing the deal and how my children's intervention had ultimately sabotaged everything. There has to be another way, Maria said when I finished. This is too important to just give up. I can't involve my children in this, Maria. Once they know about the business, everything changes. The whole dynamic of our relationship, their perception of me, their understanding of their father's memory. It's too much. What's the alternative? Keep the properties and hope another buyer comes along who won't ask these questions? I looked up at the Harrison development building, where 3 floors up, a deal worth millions of dollars was waiting for complications that seemed impossible to resolve. I don't know, I admitted. For the first time in 15 years, I honestly don't know what comes next. The taxi ride home was a blur of traffic and regret. I'd come so close to securing my family's financial future, to proving that my business acumen was as sharp as ever. Instead, I was returning home to a life where I needed permission to spend $50 and my own children monitored my every financial move. That evening, Patricia called to check on me, her voice bright with the kind of false cheer that had become routine since their intervention. "How was lunch with your friend Maria?" she asked. "Fine," I said, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. "We had a nice time." "I'm so glad you're maintaining your social connections. David was worried that you might become isolated." Isolated? If only she knew that I'd spent the afternoon in a conference room worth more than their houses combined, negotiating a deal that would have set our entire family up for generations. "Mom, are you there?" "Yes, dear, just tired." "Well, get some rest. And remember, if you need anything at all, just call." After we hung up, I sat in my study, surrounded by the evidence of everything I'd built and everything I was about to lose. The Harrison development offer would expire in 60 days. After that, I'd be back to managing properties individually, dealing with tenants and maintenance issues and all the daily complications of a business my children would never let me run if they knew it existed, unless I found the courage to tell them the truth. But the truth was more complicated than they could imagine, involving secrets about their father that I'd protected for 16 years. Once I opened that door, there would be no closing it again. I pulled out my laptop and began typing an email to James Harrison, requesting a meeting in 2 weeks. Maybe by then, I'd have figured out how to navigate the impossible choice between protecting my family's perception of their father and protecting the financial future I'd spent 15 years building. The game was far from over, but for the first time since it began, I wasn't sure I knew how to win. 3 days after the Harrison development meeting collapsed, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, sitting in my kitchen at 2 a.m, staring at old photo albums and trying to find the courage to destroy my own carefully constructed life. The photos told the story of a happy family. Robert and me on our wedding day, young and optimistic. The children as babies, toddlers, teenagers, family vacations, Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies. 38 years of marriage that looked picture perfect from the outside, with no hint of the financial chaos that had consumed the final years. I turned to a photo of Robert from our last anniversary dinner, just 6 months before his cancer diagnosis. He looked tired in ways I hadn't noticed at the time, but now I could see the stress etched around his eyes. The weight of secrets he was carrying, debts accumulating while he chased impossible wins at poker tables I didn't even know he frequented. My phone buzzed with a text message from Maria. "Any word from Harrison Development? The offer expires in 57 days. 57 days to figure out how to salvage 15 years of work, or watch it all slip away because I couldn't bring myself to tell my children the truth about their father. I closed the photo album and walked to my study, where I unlocked the drawer containing all my business records. Everything was there, meticulously organized and documented. Property deeds, rental agreements, tax returns showing profits my children couldn't imagine. Bank statements from accounts they'd never heard of. Investment portfolios that had been growing steadily for over a decade. And buried beneath it all, a manila folder I rarely opened, but could never bring myself to throw away. Robert's gambling. Debts. The statements and IOUs and threatening letters that had arrived in those final months. Evidence of the financial catastrophe I'd spent 16 years hiding from our children. The largest debt had been to someone named Vincent Carlucci, $43,000 lost over a series of high-stakes games in a private club downtown. I'd paid it off in installments over 2 years, using rental income from my first investment, properties to gradually eliminate the threat hanging over our family. The children never knew how close we'd come to losing everything, including the house they'd grown up in. They never knew their father had nearly gambled away their inheritance before he died. They still saw him as the devoted family man he'd been for most of their lives, not the desperate addict he'd become at the end. Was protecting that image worth sacrificing everything I'd built since his death? My laptop chimed with an incoming email, startling me out of my brooding. The sender was someone I hadn't heard from in months, Detective Ray Morrison, one of my longtime tenants who rented a small apartment in my Riverside property. "Mrs. Stewart, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. I see a sharp businesswoman who's built something impressive over the years, and I see adult children who think they're protecting their mother from her own poor judgment." He paused to sip his coffee. "I also see someone who might need an ally who understands both sides of that equation." "What are you proposing?" Ray leaned forward slightly. "I want to buy my unit, but not just as a straightforward sale. I'm proposing we structure it as a lease-to-own arrangement that gives you continuing income while transferring ownership gradually. More importantly, I'm willing to serve as a property manager for your other units if that would help you maintain control while satisfying your family's concerns about day-to-day management. The idea was intriguing, but I wasn't sure how it would solve my larger problems. How would that help with the Harrison development situation? It might not, Ray admitted, but it could give you time to figure out your next move without having to choose between financial opportunity and family relationships. You understand that my children have established financial guardianship? That any major transactions need their approval? I understand that your children think they've established comprehensive control over your finances, Ray said with a slight smile. But I also understand that property management agreements and business partnerships can be structured in ways that maintain operational independence even when personal finances are restricted. I felt a spark of the old excitement, the thrill of finding creative solutions to complex problems. You've given this considerable thought. I have. I've also done some research on Harrison Development. They're good people, fair dealers, but they're also traditional in their approach. They want clean transactions with no complications. But there are other developers, other investors who specialize in more complex situations, such as private equity groups that buy property portfolios from families going through transitions, estate planning specialists who help elderly property owners maximize value while maintaining control. There are more options than Harrison Development, if you're willing to explore them. Ray pulled a business card from his pocket and slid it across the table. This is a friend of mine, Jennifer Walsh. She specializes in helping older adults navigate financial transitions while maintaining their autonomy. She's dealt with family guardianship situations before. I looked at the card. Jennifer Walsh, Elder Financial Advocacy. Below her name was a tagline that made my heart skip. Protecting your right to make your own decisions. What would it cost me to consult with her? I asked. Initial consultation is free. After that, her fees are reasonable, and they're structured to come out of successful transactions rather than upfront payments. For the first time in days, I felt like I might have options beyond surrendering to my children's well-meaning, control, or destroying their memory of their father. There's something else, Ray said. Something Maria didn't mention, but that I think you should know about. What? Your daughter Patricia has been asking questions around the neighborhood. Not obvious questions, but she's been talking to other property owners, asking about property values, rental markets, that sort of thing. She's also been in touch with a real estate agent about getting appraisals on residential properties in your area. My blood ran cold. She's investigating my properties? It looks that way. My guess is she's trying to get a comprehensive picture of your financial situation to make sure nothing's been overlooked in the guardianship arrangement. The room felt like it was spinning. Patricia was actively looking for assets I hadn't disclosed, which meant she was already suspicious that there was more to my financial picture than I'd revealed. How long before she figures it out? I asked. Hard to say. Depends on how thorough she is and whether she knows what to look for. But if she's working with an attorney who specializes in elder financial issues, they'll probably find your business records eventually. I thought about Dr. Chen's assessment that morning, about Patricia's satisfied smile when I'd admitted to being scattered with financial management. Had she scheduled that evaluation because she genuinely believed I was declining? Or because she wanted professional documentation of my supposed incompetence before confronting me about hidden assets? Mr. Morrison, I said slowly, I think I need to speak with your friend Jennifer Walsh sooner rather than later. I'll call her as soon as we're done here. But Mrs. Stewart, there's something you should understand. If your daughter is building a case that you've been hiding assets or making financial decisions that put you at risk, this could get complicated very quickly. More complicated than it already is? Ray smiled grimly. Much more complicated. But the good news is, Jennifer Walsh specializes in exactly these kinds of situations. If anyone can help you navigate this while protecting both your assets and your family relationships, it's her. I left the coffee shop with Jennifer Walsh's business card in my purse and a plan to call her first thing in the morning. But as I rode the bus home, I couldn't shake the feeling that events were accelerating beyond my control. Patricia's investigation meant I was running out of time to manage this revelation on my own terms. Soon, my children would discover the business empire I'd hidden from them for 15 years. When that happened, they'd demand explanations I wasn't sure I was ready to give. The truth about their father's gambling debts was just one part of a much larger story, and I was beginning to realize that protecting them from that truth might cost me everything I'd worked to build in its aftermath. As the bus pulled up to my stop, I made a decision that had been building for days. Tomorrow, I would call Jennifer Walsh and begin the process of reclaiming control over my own life. But tonight I would do something I should have done years ago. I would start writing down the whole truth from the beginning, so that when the time came to reveal everything, I would be ready to tell the complete story of how their confused, incompetent mother had actually spent the last 15 years building them a legacy they never knew existed. The morning I decided to tell my children everything began like any other day in my carefully orchestrated life of deception. I made coffee in the kitchen where I'd raised them, ate toast at the table where they'd done homework, and prepared for what would either be the liberation or destruction of our family. Jennifer Walsh had agreed to meet me at 10 o'clock, and I'd spent the early hours organizing documents I'd never intended anyone else to see. Bank statements dating back 15 years, property acquisition records, and most importantly, the manila folder containing evidence of their father's gambling addiction that I'd protected them from for 16 years. At 9:15, my phone rang. Patricia's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with the measured calm I'd perfected over months of living under their financial supervision. "Good morning, dear." "Mom, we need to talk, all of us. Can you be ready in an hour?" Something in her voice told me my time had run out. "What's this about?" "We'll discuss it when we get there. David and Michael are coming too." The line went dead, and I knew with absolute certainty that my secret empire was about to be exposed whether I was ready or not. I called Jennifer Walsh to reschedule our meeting, then sat in my living room waiting for my children to arrive with whatever evidence they'd uncovered. They came through my front door like investigators entering a crime scene. David carried his ever-present briefcase. Patricia held a thick folder that looked ominously familiar, and Michael trailed behind them with the expression of someone who wished he could be anywhere else. "Sit down, Mom," Patricia said, and the reversal of our usual family dynamics was complete. Now she was the authority figure, and I was the child being called to account for my behavior. "We've been doing some research," David began, opening his briefcase with the efficiency of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "When we established the financial guardianship, we wanted to make sure we had a complete picture of your assets and obligations." Patricia spread papers across my coffee table like she was laying out a hand of cards. Imagine our surprise when we discovered that our supposedly financially vulnerable mother owns 8 rental properties worth approximately $1.7 million. There it was. The moment I'd been dreading and anticipating for 15 years had finally arrived. My children stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to betrayal to something that might have been admiration if it weren't overshadowed by anger. "We found the business license for Stewart Property Management," Michael said quietly. "Mom, how could you let us think you were struggling financially when you've been running a multi-million-dollar business?" I looked at my 3 children, these, adults I'd raised to be honest and principled, and realized that my years of deception had made me exactly the kind of person I'd taught them not to be. "There's more to this story than you understand," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Then explain it," David demanded. "Explain how you let us worry about your financial security while you were secretly wealthy. Explain why you accepted our help with bills while sitting on rental income that exceeds all of our salaries combined." Patricia leaned forward, her face flushed with emotion. Do you have any idea how guilty we've felt? How many sleepless nights we've had worrying about whether you had enough money for groceries or medical expenses? The guilt goes both ways, I said, and something in my tone made them all stop talking. You think I've been lying to you about money? You have no idea what I've been protecting you from. I stood up and walked to my study, returning with the manila folder I'd hoped never to open in their presence. I placed it on the coffee table next to their property research, and the contrast was stark. Their papers were clean, organized, filled with evidence of success and careful planning. My folder was worn, stained with tears and time, containing the wreckage of secrets I'd carried alone for 16 years. Your father was a gambling addict, I said, and the words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. In the last 5 years of his life, he accumulated debts that nearly destroyed our family financially. David's face went pale. That's impossible. Dad was responsible with money. He taught us about budgeting and saving. He taught you those things because he knew how dangerous it was when financial discipline breaks down, I replied. And for most of our marriage, he practiced what he preached. But toward the end, something changed. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a statement from a private gambling club showing Robert's accumulated losses over several months. $43,000 to Vincent Carlucci alone. There were others. Smaller amounts, but they added up. Patricia reached for the paper with trembling hands. This can't be real. Credit card cash advances, loans against his life insurance, policy, a second mortgage on this house that I didn't know existed until he was dying. I pulled out more documents, spreading them across the table like evidence in a trial. By the time he confessed, we were almost $200,000 in debt. Michael slumped back in his chair. Why didn't you tell us? Because he begged me not to, I said, my voice breaking for the first time. He was dying of cancer, consumed with guilt about what he'd done to our family. His last coherent conversation was about protecting his memory, making sure his children remembered him as the good father he'd been for most of their lives, not as the desperate addict he became at the end. David was studying the documents with the intensity he brought to his business dealings. These debts, how did you pay them off? I used my mother's inheritance as a down payment and convinced the creditors to accept monthly installments. Then I bought my first rental property and used the income to pay them down systematically. That's why you started the business, Patricia said with dawning understanding. Not to build wealth, but to pay off Dad's gambling debts. Initially, yes, but over time it became something more. I realized I was good at property investment, that I could build something substantial that would protect all of you if anything ever happened to me. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. My children sat surrounded, by evidence of both their father's failures and my successes, trying to reconcile 16 years of carefully constructed beliefs with the reality I'd finally revealed. The late bill payments, David said slowly. The unusual purchases we thought were signs of confusion. Strategic business decisions that I couldn't explain without revealing everything else, I confirmed. The hardware store purchase was materials for renovating a rental unit. The money I gave to Maria Gonzalez was a business loan that she repaid with interest. Patricia looked up from the gambling debt documents with tears in her eyes. All this time we thought we were protecting you from making bad financial decisions. You were protecting someone who'd been making complex financial decisions successfully for 15 years while carrying the weight of secrets you couldn't imagine. Michael finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. Dad really gambled. Away almost everything? He lost control, I said gently. Addiction is a disease, not a character flaw. The father who taught you to throw a baseball and helped with your homework was the real Robert Stewart. The man who lost money at poker tables was someone the disease created. But why keep it secret for so long? David asked. Even after. The debts were paid even after you'd built the business into something successful. It was the question I'd been asking myself for years, and the answer was more complicated than I'd wanted to admit. Because once you start lying to protect someone, it becomes harder and harder to tell the truth, I said. Because I was afraid that knowing about your father's addiction would change how you remembered him, and by extension, how you thought about yourselves. And because, I continued, looking at each of them in turn, I was afraid that if you knew how much money I had, it would change our relationship. I didn't want to become a resource to be managed or influenced. I wanted to remain your mother first and a wealthy woman second. Patricia wiped tears from her cheeks. So you let us treat you like an incompetent elderly woman who couldn't be trusted with her own money. I let you care for me in the way that felt right to you, even when it felt wrong to me. The silence stretched on until David finally closed his briefcase and leaned back in his chair. What happens now? It was the question I'd been preparing for, the reason I'd called Jennifer Walsh and begun planning for this moment. Now you know the truth, I said. All of it. Your father's addiction, my business success, and the reasons I kept both hidden. The question is what we do with that knowledge. We need to dissolve the financial guardianship immediately, Patricia said firmly. You've proven you're more than capable of managing your own affairs. It's not that simple, I replied. The guardianship was established through legal channels. We'll need attorneys and court proceedings to reverse it properly. Then we'll do whatever it takes, David said. Mom, I'm sorry. We thought we were helping, but we were undermining everything you'd built. Michael had been quiet through most of the conversation, but now he looked up with an expression of dawning realization. The Harrison development deal. That's why you couldn't move forward with the sale, because we'd restricted your financial authority. I nodded. $4.2 million for the entire portfolio. It would have been the culmination of 15 years of work, and it fell through because the buyers couldn't be sure I had legal authority to complete the transaction. Is the offer still open? Patricia asked. For another month, assuming they haven't found another property portfolio that meets their needs. David pulled out his phone. I'm calling our attorney right now. We need to start the process of reversing this guardianship immediately. But I held up my hand to stop him. There's something else we need to discuss first. Something more important than business deals or legal procedures. They waited, and I could see in their faces the apprehension of people who'd already absorbed more revelations than they'd expected. Your father's addiction destroyed our family's financial security, but it didn't destroy his love for you or his role as your father. The lessons he taught you about responsibility and integrity were real, even if he couldn't follow them himself at the end. I pulled out the photo of Robert from our last anniversary dinner, the one where I could now see the stress and guilt in his eyes. I've protected his memory for 16 years because I thought that was what he would have wanted. But maybe it's time to let him be human, flawed and struggling, but still the father who loved you unconditionally. Patricia reached over and took my hand. Mom, you don't have to carry these secrets alone anymore. And you don't have to protect us from difficult truths, David added. We're adults. We can handle knowing that our father was imperfect. Michael stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden his father had planted 30 years ago. I think I always knew something was wrong in those last years. He was different, more stressed, but I thought it was just the cancer. The cancer made everything worse, I said. But the gambling started before the diagnosis. Maybe the stress of getting older, of feeling like he was running out of time to provide for our future. I don't know what triggered it, and I stopped trying to understand it years ago. What I understand now, David said, is that you took a catastrophic situation and turned it into something positive. You didn't just pay off Dad's debts, you built wealth that secured all of our futures. I built options, I corrected. Choices for all of us. College funds for the grandchildren, emergency resources if anyone faces financial difficulties, security for my own old age that doesn't depend on your charity. Patricia was studying the property documents again, seeing them now with new understanding. This is why you never needed our help, even when we thought you did. I never needed your money, I said, but I always needed your love and concern. Even when it felt controlling, even when it undermined my independence, it came from a place of genuine care. The afternoon wore on as we talked through 15 years of questions and misconceptions. I explained how I'd structured the business to minimize taxes while maximizing profits. I showed them detailed records of every property acquisition, every renovation project, every strategic decision that had built my portfolio from a desperate necessity into a thriving enterprise. David asked about investment strategies and market timing. Patricia wanted to understand how I'd managed to maintain the properties while appearing to live on a limited income. Michael was most interested in the human side of the business, the tenants I'd helped and the relationships I'd built in communities they'd never known I was part of. As evening approached, we found ourselves in a new configuration as a family. The children who'd arrived that morning thinking they were confronting a deceptive elderly woman were leaving with a new understanding of their mother as a savvy businesswoman, who'd carried impossible burdens to protect both their inheritance and their memories. "What happens with Harrison Development?" Patricia asked as they prepared to leave. "I'll call them tomorrow and explain that the family situation has been resolved," I said. "Whether they're still interested in moving forward remains to be seen. And if they're not, then I'll explore other options. Ray Morrison has introduced me to people who specialize in complex property transactions. There are other paths forward." David paused at the door. "Mom, I know this doesn't fix everything, but I'm proud of what you built, and I'm sorry we made you feel like you had to hide it from us." After they left, I sat in my study surrounded by documents that were no longer secrets. The business records, the property deeds, the evidence of 15 years of careful planning and strategic thinking. All of it now visible to the children I'd protected it from for so long. My phone rang, and I saw Jennifer Walsh's name on the caller ID. "Mrs. Stewart, I hope you don't mind me calling this evening. I've been thinking about our rescheduled meeting." "Actually, Ms. Walsh, I think the situation may have resolved itself today." I explained about my children's discovery of the business and our afternoon conversation about the gambling debts and financial guardianship. "That's wonderful news," she said. "Though I hope you understand that reversing the guardianship will take some time, even with their cooperation." "How long?" "A few weeks if everyone's in agreement and the courts aren't backlogged. In the meantime, you might want to get documentation from your attorney stating that the family is working together to resolve the guardianship situation. That could help with any business transactions you want to complete." "Like the Harrison Development deal?" "Exactly like that. Mrs. Stewart, from what you've told me, you've built something remarkable while managing an impossible family situation. You should be proud of what you've accomplished." After we hung up, I called Maria to tell her about the day's revelations. She listened with amazement as I described my children's reactions to learning about both the business empire and their father's gambling addiction. "So they're supportive now?" she asked. "More than supportive. They're working to reverse the guardianship as quickly as possible." "And Harrison Development?" "I'll call James Harrison first thing tomorrow morning. If the offer is still open, I'll ask for a 2-week extension to get the legal complications sorted out. And if it's not?" I looked around my study. This room where I'd planned and schemed and built something from nothing while carrying secrets that had nearly crushed me. "Then I'll find another way forward. I've been solving impossible problems for 15 years. I'm not going to stop now." The next morning, I called Harrison Development and asked to speak with James Harrison directly. When he came on the line, I could hear the wariness in his voice. "Mrs. Stewart, I wasn't expecting to hear from you again." "Mr. Harrison, I'm calling to tell you that the family complications I mentioned have been resolved. My children now understand the full scope of my business activities, and they're working with me to reverse the financial guardianship arrangements. There was a pause. That's unexpected. When you say resolved, what exactly do you mean? I mean that I told them the truth about everything, and they're now supporting my business decisions rather than interfering with them. And the guardianship will be formally dissolved within a few weeks. In the meantime, I can provide documentation showing that all parties are working together to restore my full legal authority. Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Stewart, may I ask what changed? I thought about how to answer that question honestly. They discovered that their efforts to protect me from bad financial decisions were actually preventing me from making the best financial decision of my career. James Harrison laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. Mrs. Stewart, I have to say, in 30 years of doing these deals, I've never had a seller whose family dynamics were quite so interesting. Is the offer still open? It is. And given what you've just told me, I think we should schedule another meeting. This time, if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to meet your children as well. Not because I need their permission, but because I think they should understand exactly what kind of business their mother has built. 3 days later, I found myself back in the Harrison Development Conference Room, but this time I wasn't alone. David sat to my right in his best suit, Patricia to my left with a legal pad for taking notes, and Michael across from me looking both nervous and proud. James Harrison and his team seemed genuinely impressed by the family unity we now presented, and even more impressed when they understood the full story of how I'd built the property portfolio while simultaneously paying off substantial debts. Mrs. Stewart, James said during a break in negotiations, when we first met, I thought we were dealing with an elderly property owner looking to simplify her affairs. I now realize we're dealing with one of the most successful small-scale property developers I've encountered. The deal closed 37 days later. $4.2 million for 15 years of work, transferred to accounts my children now knew existed and understood the origin of. After paying capital gains taxes and settling all remaining business obligations, I was left with more money than I could spend in my remaining lifetime. But more importantly, I was left with something I'd lost along the way: the ability to be completely honest with my children about who I was and what I'd accomplished. 6 months after the sale closed, we established the Robert Stewart Memorial Foundation, dedicated to helping families affected by gambling addiction. It felt like the right way to honor both the father they'd loved and the disease that had nearly destroyed us all. Patricia took early retirement from her job to help me manage the foundation. David provided business consulting for the investment strategies that would sustain it long-term. Michael organized community outreach programs in neighborhoods where I'd once owned rental properties. We'd become a family again, but a different kind of family than we'd been before. One built on complete honesty, rather than protective deception, on shared understanding of both triumph and failure. I kept one property from the portfolio, a small apartment building where I still collect rents and maintain relationships with tenants who've become more like extended family over the years. It reminds me daily that building wealth was never really about the money itself, but about the security and choices that money provides. My children no longer worry about my financial competence or try to protect me from my own decisions. Instead, they marvel at what I was able to accomplish. While carrying burdens they never knew existed, they understand now that sometimes the people who seem most vulnerable are actually the strongest among us. And sometimes, the best way to protect the people you love is to let them see you as you really are. Flaws and strengths and secrets and all. The business empire I built in secret became the foundation for a legacy we could all be proud of. But the real treasure wasn't the money I accumulated or the properties I developed. It was the moment my children looked at me and saw not just their elderly mother who needed protection, but a woman who'd faced impossible circumstances and found a way to turn them into triumph. That recognition, that respect, that understanding was worth more than all the rental income and capital gains combined. It was the return on an investment I'd been making for 15 years without even realizing it. The investment in proving to myself and my family that I was capable of extraordinary things, even in the most ordinary circumstances. 2 years have passed since the day my children discovered the business empire I'd hidden from them for 15 years, and I still wake up some mornings surprised by the silence. Not the quiet of an empty house, but the absence of the weight I carried for so long. The secrets that once pressed against my chest like stones have been lifted away, leaving behind a lightness I'd forgotten was possible. This morning, I'm sitting in what used to be my secret office, but is now simply my office, reviewing applications for the Robert Stewart Memorial Foundation. The irony isn't lost on me that I now spend my days helping other families navigate the same kind of crisis I once faced alone. The difference is that these families don't have to carry their burdens in silence the way I did. The foundation has become something larger than I ever imagined when we first conceived it as a way to honor Robert's memory while addressing the disease that had consumed his final years. In 24 months, we've provided counseling services to over 300 families affected by gambling addiction, offered financial planning assistance to people recovering from gambling-related debt, and funded research into addiction treatment programs. Patricia walks into the office carrying 2 cups of coffee and a stack of thank you letters from families we've helped. She's been working with the foundation full-time since she took early retirement, and I've watched her transform from my worried daughter into a confident advocate for people facing impossible circumstances. Mrs. Chen called this morning, she says, settling into the chair across from my desk. Her husband completed the treatment program, and they've paid off the last of their gambling debts. She wanted to thank you personally for the emergency assistance we provided when they were about to lose their house. Mrs. Chen's story had reminded me so much of my own experience that I'd insisted we expedite her application for emergency funding. Her husband had hidden gambling debts from online poker, accumulating losses over several years while maintaining the appearance of financial stability. When the truth finally came out, they were facing foreclosure within 30 days. That's wonderful news, I say, accepting the coffee gratefully. How many families does that make who've successfully completed the program this quarter? 17, Patricia replies, consulting her notes. And we have 12 new applications pending review. The numbers represent real people with real stories, families who'd been where I once was. Some of them were spouses discovering hidden debts for the first time. Others were adult children trying to help addicted parents. A few were the gamblers themselves, finally ready to admit they needed help. There's something else, Patricia continues. David got a call from that documentary filmmaker yesterday. She's still interested in telling our story. I set down my coffee cup, considering the proposition that had been on the table for several months. A filmmaker named Rebecca Martinez had approached us about creating a documentary about families affected by gambling addiction, using our story as a central narrative. The idea made me uncomfortable, not because I was ashamed of what we'd been through, but because I wasn't sure I wanted our private struggles turned into public entertainment. What did David tell her? That he'd discuss it with us at today's meeting. She's willing to structure it so that all proceeds go to the foundation, and she's promised editorial control so we can ensure the story is told accurately. Today's meeting. Every month, my 3 children and I gather to review foundation business and make decisions about grant applications and program expansions. It's become one of my favorite parts of running the organization, seeing how my adult children approach problems and contribute their unique perspectives to solutions. Michael arrives first, as he usually does, carrying a briefcase that's become as much a part of his identity as David's used to be. He's taken on the community outreach programs with the same methodical approach he brings to his regular job, but with an enthusiasm I'd never seen in him before. I have updates from 3 of the support groups, he says, pulling out his laptop. The Wednesday evening group has grown to 15 regular attendees, and they've requested additional funding for childcare so more parents can participate. David arrives precisely on time, tablet in hand, ready to review financial reports and investment strategies. Since the foundation launched, he's applied his business acumen to ensuring our resources are managed efficiently and sustainably. The investment portfolio performed better than projected last quarter, he reports. We're on track to increase grant funding by 20% next year if the current trends continue. As we work through the agenda, I'm struck by how much our family dynamic has changed since the day they confronted me about my hidden business empire. The children who once felt they needed to protect me from my own financial decisions now rely on my experience and judgment when making complex decisions about foundation operations. About the documentary proposal, David says when we reach that item on the agenda. I think we should consider it, but with very specific conditions about how the story is presented. Patricia nods. Rebecca Martinez showed me her previous work. She's sensitive to family privacy concerns, and her films focus on systemic issues rather than exploiting personal trauma. Michael looks thoughtful. If it helps other families recognize the warning signs earlier than we did, it might be worth the discomfort of sharing our story publicly. I listen to them discuss the pros and cons, these three adults who've become my partners in ways I never expected. They're no longer my children seeking approval or trying to shield me from difficult decisions. They're colleagues who happen to share my DNA, contributing their skills and perspectives to work that matters to all of us. What concerns me, I say finally, is the potential for oversimplification. Our story is complicated. Your father's addiction, my secret business, the financial guardianship, the family reconciliation, it all fits together in ways that might be hard to explain in a 2-hour film. That's exactly why Rebecca wants editorial control to remain with us, Patricia says. She understands that real life doesn't fit neatly into documentary formulas. David pulls up something on his tablet. I've been researching her previous films. She did a documentary about families affected by opioid addiction that was both respectful and effective at raising awareness. The families she featured said she captured their experiences authentically. And the foundation needs the visibility, Michael adds. We're helping people in this region, but there are families dealing with gambling addiction everywhere. A documentary could help us expand our reach. I think about Mrs. Chen, about the relief in her voice when she called to report her husband's successful completion of treatment. I think about the other families we've helped, and the thousands more we haven't reached because they don't know we exist. If we do this, I say, I want the focus to be on the addiction and recovery, not on the financial success story. The business empire I built isn't the point. The point is that families can survive these crises and come out stronger on the other side. Agreed, David says. The money was a tool for solving problems, not the solution itself. Patricia makes a note. I'll call Rebecca and schedule a longer conversation about her vision for the project. We can always say no if it doesn't feel right. After the meeting ends and my children return to their regular jobs, I remain in the office reviewing grant applications. Each one tells a story of a family in crisis, people facing the same kinds of impossible choices I once confronted alone. One application is from a woman whose husband had hidden gambling debts from cryptocurrency speculation. Another is from adult children trying to help their mother who'd become addicted to online slot machines. A third is from a young man seeking treatment funding because his gambling habit had cost him his job and his apartment. I approve funding for all three applications, remembering how desperate I'd felt when I first discovered the extent of Robert's debts. Money alone won't solve their problems, but it can provide breathing room while they work on longer-term solutions. My phone rings, and I see Maria's name on the caller ID. She's been working with a different property management company since I sold my portfolio to Harrison Development, but we've remained close friends and occasional business partners. Doña Donna, I have a proposition for you, she says without preamble. There's a small apartment building coming on the market, 6 units in a neighborhood that's starting to gentrify. The owner needs to sell quickly, and the asking price is below market value. I'm not looking to get back into property management, I tell her, though I can hear the enthusiasm in her voice. I'm not suggesting you manage it. I'm suggesting we buy it together as an investment, with the proceeds going to the foundation. It could be a model for sustainable funding that doesn't depend entirely on donations and investment returns. The idea intrigues me, despite my initial resistance. Since selling my portfolio, I've missed the tangible nature of property investment, the ability to see exactly where my money was going and what it was accomplishing. Tell me more about the property. 6 units, all currently rented to long-term tenants with below-market rents. The neighborhood is improving but hasn't completely gentrified yet. We could maintain affordable housing while generating returns for the foundation. It's an appealing concept, combining my experience in property investment with the foundation's mission of helping families in financial crisis. Affordable housing and gambling addiction recovery aren't obviously connected, but both address the basic human need for stability and security. Send me the property details, I say. I'll review them and get back to you. After we hang up, I sit back in my chair and consider how much my life has changed since that morning 2 years ago, when my children took away my credit cards. They'd been trying to protect a confused elderly woman from her own poor judgment. Instead, they'd nearly prevented a savvy businesswoman from making the most important financial decision of her career. The misunderstanding had been built on layers of deception and good intentions, secrets kept to protect people who didn't need protection, and assumptions made without understanding the full picture. It had taken a crisis to force all of us to confront the truth about our family's financial history and my business capabilities. But the resolution had been worth the pain of revelation. My children now understand not just what I built, but why I built it, and how I maintained it, while carrying secrets that could have destroyed our family's cohesion. They respect my judgment because they've seen evidence of my competence, not just heard my claims about it. More importantly, we've found a way to honor Robert's memory that acknowledges both his strengths as a father and his struggles with addiction. The foundation doesn't pretend that gambling addiction is a moral failing or a character weakness. It treats it as a disease that affects entire families, requiring comprehensive support for recovery and healing. I think about the thank you letter from Mrs. Chen that Patricia showed me this morning. She'd written about the shame and isolation she'd felt when her husband's addiction was first discovered, about the fear that their children would lose respect for their father if they learned the truth about the family's financial crisis. Those feelings were so familiar to me that reading her letter had been like looking into a mirror that reflected my own experience from 16 years ago. The difference was that Mrs. Chen's family had access to resources and support that hadn't existed when I was facing similar challenges alone. That evening, I called Jennifer Walsh to update her on the foundation's progress and to get her perspective on Maria's property investment proposal. Jennifer had been instrumental in helping us navigate the legal complexities of dissolving the financial guardianship, and she'd become both a professional advisor and a personal friend. "It sounds like a natural evolution of your work," she says after I explain the concept. "Property investment was how you built financial security for your family. Now you're using those same skills to build security for other families." I'm concerned about mission creep, I admit. We started as a foundation focused on gambling addiction recovery. Are we losing focus if we expand into affordable housing? Not if you can articulate the connection clearly. Housing stability is crucial for families recovering from financial trauma. If you're providing both addiction services and affordable housing, you're addressing the problem more comprehensively. Jennifer's perspective helps clarify my thinking about the proposal. The Foundation's mission has always been broader than just funding treatment programs. We're trying to help families rebuild their lives after gambling addiction has disrupted their financial stability. There's something else to consider, Jennifer continues. You've been running the foundation for 2 years now, and you've proven that your business skills translate well to nonprofit management. You might want to think about expanding your model to other communities. The suggestion surprises me. I'd been so focused on helping families in our immediate area that I hadn't considered the possibility of replicating our approach elsewhere. How would that work? Franchise-style operations, maybe. Local foundations that use your model but operate independently. Or satellite programs that report to your main organization but serve different geographic regions. It's an intriguing concept, but also overwhelming. At 76, I'm not sure I have the energy to manage a multi-state foundation network, even with my children's help. Something to think about, Jennifer says, reading my hesitation correctly. You don't have to decide anything immediately, but you should know that your approach is getting attention from other communities dealing with similar problems. After we hang up, I spend the evening reviewing Maria's property information and thinking about Jennifer's expansion suggestions. Both represent opportunities to leverage my experience and resources to help more people, but they also represent commitments that would shape the next phase of my life. The apartment building Maria has identified is exactly the kind of property I would have purchased during my years as an active investor. Good bones, solid neighborhood, potential for appreciation, and current rent rolls that suggest responsible management. The difference is that instead of building personal wealth, the profits would support families in crisis. I email Maria to tell her I'm interested in moving forward with the investment, then spend some time researching affordable housing programs in other cities. Jennifer is right that our model could be replicated elsewhere, but the logistics would be complex and the management requirements substantial. The next morning, Patricia calls with news about the documentary project. Rebecca Martinez wants to meet with all of us next week, she says. She's prepared a detailed treatment outlining how she envisions structuring the film, and she's willing to give us approval rights over the final edit. What's her timeline? Filming would begin in 6 months, with a projected release date next year. She wants to follow several families through their recovery processes, using our story as context for understanding how gambling addiction affects different types of households. The timeline appeals to me because it's not rushed. Too many documentary projects try to capture complex family dynamics in unrealistically short periods, resulting in superficial treatments of serious subjects. I'll meet with her, I decide, but I want David and Michael there too. If we're going to do this, we need to be united in our approach. She's also interested in filming some foundation activities, showing how personal experience with gambling addiction led to community advocacy. That aspect of the project feels more comfortable to me than focusing on my individual story. The Foundation's work speaks for itself, and documenting our approach might help other communities develop similar programs. Schedule the meeting, I tell Patricia. But make it clear that we're still in the information gathering phase. We're not committed to participating yet. The following week brings the meeting with Rebecca Martinez, who turns out to be younger than I expected, but clearly experienced in handling sensitive documentary subjects. She's done her research on our family's story and the Foundation's work, asking thoughtful questions about our motivations and objectives. What I'm most interested in, she explains, is how families can emerge from crisis stronger than they were before. Your story isn't just about surviving gambling addiction or building wealth in secret. It's about the possibility of transforming trauma into purpose. David nods appreciatively. That's exactly what happened with us. The crisis forced us to confront issues we'd been avoiding, and ultimately brought us closer together. But I don't want to romanticize the process, Rebecca continues. Recovery from gambling addiction is difficult, and family reconciliation after major deception doesn't happen overnight. I want to show the real work involved in rebuilding trust and communication. Michael asks about her approach to protecting family privacy while still telling an authentic story. Rebecca explains her strategy of focusing on universal themes while respecting personal boundaries. allowing families to share what they're comfortable revealing while maintaining editorial integrity. Would you include other families in the documentary? I ask. Absolutely. Your story provides context and demonstrates that recovery is possible, but I want to show multiple perspectives on gambling addiction and family intervention. By the end of the meeting, I'm cautiously optimistic about the project. Rebecca seems to understand that our story is ultimately about resilience and transformation rather than victimization and blame. She's also committed to ensuring that any proceeds from the film support addiction recovery programs. I'll need to discuss this with my children privately, I tell her. Can we have a week to make our decision? Of course. And if you decide to participate, we can negotiate specific terms about editorial control and how the family's privacy will be protected. After Rebecca leaves, my children and I spend an hour discussing the potential benefits and risks of participating in the documentary. David is enthusiastic about the possibility of reaching wider audiences with information about gambling addiction. Patricia is concerned about maintaining privacy while still telling an effective story. Michael wants assurance that the film won't exploit our father's memory for dramatic effect. Ultimately, I say, this isn't just my decision to make. The documentary would affect all of us, and we need to be unanimous in our choice. What do you think, Mom? Patricia asks. You're the one who carried these secrets for 16 years. You're the one who would be most exposed by a public telling of our story. I think about Mrs. Chen's thank you letter, about the dozens of families we've helped through the foundation, about the thousands more who might benefit if our story encourages them to seek help earlier in their own crises. I think, I say slowly, that secrets have enough power over our family for one lifetime. If sharing our story publicly can help other families avoid the isolation and shame we experienced, then maybe it's time to tell it. David smiles. Then we're unanimous. We'll participate in the documentary. 6 months later, Rebecca Martinez and her film crew spend a week documenting foundation activities and interviewing our family about our experiences with gambling addiction and financial secrecy. The process is emotionally challenging, but ultimately cathartic, forcing us to articulate lessons learned and insights gained. The apartment building purchase with Maria has been finalized, and the property is generating steady income for the foundation while providing affordable housing for 6 families. We're already looking at potential second property, encouraged by the success of our pilot program. The documentary, titled Hidden Burdens, Families, Addiction, and the Power of Truth, premieres at a regional film festival 18 months after our first meeting with Rebecca Martinez. The response is overwhelmingly positive, with several other communities expressing interest in replicating our foundation model. Most importantly, the film generates inquiries from families struggling with gambling addiction who hadn't known where to turn for help. Our foundation receives funding requests from people across the country, and we begin developing partnerships with organizations in other states to expand our reach without overextending our resources. On the evening of the film's premiere, I sit in a theater watching my life story unfold on screen. The woman on film is recognizable as me, but she's also someone I'm still getting to know. A person who's learned to live without secrets, who's found purpose in helping others navigate crises she's survived herself. The credits roll, and I realize that the story isn't really finished. The foundation continues to grow. My children continue to surprise me with their insights and capabilities, and families continue to discover that they can survive and thrive after experiencing what seems like insurmountable financial and emotional trauma. 2 years ago, my children thought they were protecting a confused elderly woman from her own poor judgment. Today, they're my partners in work that matters, colleagues who respect my experience while contributing their own expertise to solving complex problems. The business empire I built in secret has been transformed into something more valuable than rental income or property appreciation. It's become a foundation for helping other families discover their own resilience, their own capacity for recovery and renewal. And the secrets that once felt like stones pressing against my chest have been transformed into stories that offer hope to people facing their own impossible circumstances. That transformation, more than any financial return or business success, feels like the true measure of a life well lived. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.